when 2,000 people were forced out of their homes, were forced out of town actually, at gunpoint because of the mayor's racist edict. Our guest speaker, author Cody McDevitt, will give an in-depth presentation about the banishment. But before we go further, this event cannot have been possible without the further support of individuals from the community, in particular the Johnstown Area Heritage Association, which has been firmly committed to holding this commemoration since its inception more than a year ago. Please welcome JAHA's Director of Marketing and Communications, Shelly Johansson, to bring remarks on behalf of JAHA.
Thank you, Clyde. It's really an honor to welcome you all here. My name is Shelly Johansson, and I am the Director of Marketing and Communications. And when Dr. Carol and Rachel and some other people who were involved in the planning of this got in touch with me and said, does Jaha want to be involved? Absolutely yes. Absolutely yes. This is the type of thing that Jaha exists to do. We're very pleased to be holding this program here in this facility tonight to commemorate this really difficult and painful racist incident in Johnstown's history. So on behalf of Jaha, welcome you all. We are very glad you're here. In addition to welcome you all, I want to welcome Reverend Sylvia King. She's here, I believe. Yes, there she is. Yes, so glad to have her here with us. And I'd also like to welcome Jackie Gumby. Where is she? The beautiful photography that she enjoyed. If you did not have the opportunity to browse her photography, I hope you will do so after the program. It's truly remarkable, really beautiful stuff, really worth seeing. So I would like to welcome Jackie to the podium here to introduce tonight's speaker.
Good evening, everyone. Our speaker tonight is Cody McDevitt. Cody is an award-winning investigative reporter from Western Pennsylvania. His work has appeared in the Pittsburgh Quarterly, the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette, Table Magazine, Mount Lebanon Magazine, and he co-authored the book, Pittsburgh Drinks, A History of Cocktails, Nightlife, and Bartending Tradition. Cody has won a Golden Quill Award from the Pennsylvania News Media Association and the Pennsylvania Associated Press Media Editors Organization. In addition, he captured the Ray Sprigal Memorial Award for an expose on how OSHA stopped working during the coronavirus pandemic. His book, Banished from Johnstown, Racist Backlash in Pennsylvania, the subject of the talk tonight, won a bronze medal in the Ippy Awards in 2021. This book is credited with bringing to life the long forgotten and largely hidden history we commemorate tonight. Please welcome Cody McDevitt to tell us what led to the banishment of about 2,000 people from the Johnstown area 100 years ago.
I've been a journalist in Western Pennsylvania, though I now cover reproductive rights on a national scale, and I have for the last 3 years, but before that I was basically a local regional reporter that, in addition to writing on Black history, I have actually a speech impediment, so I'm trying to not have my voice break, but at the same time speak loud enough for everyone to hear. In addition to writing this book, I've also written World War II history, where I tracked down veterans in Somerset County, and I interviewed about, I'd say about 50 of them, and then we wrote a compendium of short stories about World War II accounts. I was a reporter at the Somerset Daily Mirror 2020 was laid off, like half the newspaper force in the country. I do want to say that this project wouldn't have been possible without the support of my editor, Brian Wick, who I invited here, that is actually at a trappers convention right now. But it's proof that journalism, when it's supported, when it's funded, and when it's financed, can do remarkable things. And so when people ask me how this started, it started because I went to this historical association and I asked the president what was a really good Black history story to write about. And so he said, in sort of, I don't want to say passing terms, he just said, in 1923 there were about 2,000 Black people that were forced out, and there was also Mexicans. And I don't think that he thought it wasn't serious. He thought it was serious enough to write a story about and recollect. It was that at that point, the research technology that we now have available to us hadn't been available to him. And so, for instance, now we have things called newspaper databases. Does anyone use newspapers.com at all? Genealogical research. So things like this, like unearthing ethnic cleansings, racial cleansing, lynchings, attempted lynchings, as these newspapers have been added to these repositories, being able to reconstruct these types of events in local history books has become possible. And so there's a famous historian, Henry Louis Gates, you'll know him. He's actually called for the digitization of newspapers because he says the more that we add these to these repositories, the more that these types of stories will be unearthed. And I'll give you an instance. Right now, there's a separate racial cleansing. Same thing as what happened here. It happened in Stowe Township in Pittsburgh. And so I'm researching this now and have a bunch of open records requests to get official investigations and track down photographs, possibly, of this. But I'm going to sit here and I'm going to give you the scope of these types of incidents. It wasn't isolated simply to Johnstown. It happened in an estimated 400 communities in Pennsylvania, as well as throughout America, including California and New York City. First one. Okay, where's the next one? Actually, it's hard to see. Between 1890 and 1940, this was known as the nadir, which is the low point of racial equality. That's hard to believe since slavery seems like a low point, and it was in some ways. But this is reference to the post-slavery America. There was one lynching every 4 days in America, in the South, which is one of the reasons why there was a migration up north along with the poor living conditions of sharecroppers. As they came up north, they would go into these communities that they were recruited in, mills, mines, northern industrial centers that would send people south to bring up cheap labor to work in those facilities. As they came, there was a massive population built up in places like Johnstown. There was, I think, in Rosedale, an estimated population of about 3,000. That was made up of Black people as well as Mexicans that were recruited at El Paso in Texas. So next one. When they came, and this is frequently what Latinos are now actually experiencing too, is as they come, they're associated with crime. And so as you can see, well, you probably can't see the word on the light I'll read it to you. Its wave of crime seems to be sweeping the city. Negroes under arrest. This shows the effect. If you're a media studies scholar or professor, this shows the effect that media coverage can have on the population. And so there's a lot of suspicion that's bred among the white population towards these newcomers from the South and also from Mexico. Next one. At the time, white supremacy was at its peak. And this is something that has been successful for any movement building, whether it's a civil rights movement, a women's movement, or even a movement for white supremacy, it's usually the most successful when the appeals are grounded in local politics or messaging or culture. And so for the Klan, what that meant is finding whatever intolerances prevail in the community and then using that as the recruitment material. And so if it was an anti-Black bias, that's what they would emphasize. If people had hostility towards Jewish people, they would emphasize things like Leo Frank or the fact that they wanted to portray the image that Jews control the media, finances, and everything. That would be a point of material. They were also anti-Catholic. So my ancestors, Irish, Catholic, were also people that they didn't like. Next one. What's that one? There you go, next one. Okay, so in 1923, there was a shooting. It involved a Black man who was known as a troublemaker in the community. He came from Alabama, where he was suspected of serious crimes. And he was in marital distress with his wife, Rose. And so they got in an argument over her alleged infidelity. And he went out to drink with his friend Levi. And so he got really drunk, took a bunch of drugs, drove home, got in a car accident after he got in an argument with the man. And then a police officer came up to pull him over and said, "What's going on?" And then shot the police officer. A bunch of cops were called to the scene, and then 3 more officers were shot and killed. As this happens, and as the news breaks throughout the community, there's all sorts of outrage. There are mobs that form to burn Black neighborhoods, Black churches, to decry the wrongdoer and say that this is not a reflection of the Black community, it's one individual, he does not represent us. And it creates a bunch of hostility. And there was also, at the time, an election that was going on. Go to the next one. And Joseph Cauffiel. So I was talking to a reporter about, like, do you see any parallels between this person and Donald Trump? Anyone who's read the book? It's really weird because I started researching this in probably about 2014, and Barack Obama was president then. And so I just thought it was an interesting Black history story. And then Donald Trump declared for the presidency. And then pretty much it was about 4 years. And as I was writing this, I was like, you know, it's eerily similar to what is going on now, which is that there's a lot of race baiting and a lot of inflammatory rhetoric. And so in Cauffiel's case, he was running for re-election. And so he needed something that would galvanize the vote and turn the election in his favor. And since white supremacy prevailed in much of Johnstown at the time, he thought exploiting this situation would deliver the primary election to him. So, next one. On September 7, 1923, 100 years ago to this day, he called the Johnstown Democrat. They sent a reporter, Ray Prim, to the office where they asked him and interviewed him about a bunch of questions. At the time, Cauffiel had ordered every Black church, every Black gathering place closed. They couldn't congregate, they couldn't have weapons, they couldn't purchase weapons. And then he told the reporter that he wanted every Black person in Mexican who had been there less than 7 years to leave. He tried to delineate the long-time Black residents from the ones that came up during the Great Migration, because he wanted to sort of make it seem less racist, which is kind of, but for all intents and purposes, if you go through a community and say, a racist is not going to go up to a person who's been here longer than 7 years, they're just going to say, get out of town. And so that was ultimately the effect that it had. The next one. This is a picture of Rosedale. As this order was passed, the Ku Klux Klan burned crosses in 14 mills outside of Johnstown. They were seen on a foggy night, as described in the newspaper, the Johnstown Democrat. This is an unfortunate part, and I've tried to, the Johnstown Democrat incident, there's a gap in the newspaper coverage. When the microfilm goes up to September 19th, but we can't really see what happened in Johnstown after that. The Tribune, there were two newspapers, the Johnstown Tribune and the Johnstown Democrat. And the Tribune basically didn't really cover it. And the Democrat was the only one that really did. Next one. Because there wasn't really much of an editorial voice for black people in Johnstown, as it was in Pittsburgh and other communities, it was the Pittsburgh Courier that was the source of information. It was one of the most important black newspapers in the country, along with the Chicago Defender. There were others as well, there were papers in Baltimore and Harlem, but it was the Defender and the Courier that were the most important publications. One of the things that they did in these newspapers, they focused on high achievement in black communities, graduations, go focus on more flattering aspects, weddings, anniversaries, events, ribbon cuttings, things that weren't covered in the white newspaper, which usually focused on the lurid details like crime, sex, and vice in the black community, which is what I went over earlier, which gave white people the jaded view of the black community. Next one. At the head of this newspaper was a fairly remarkable man, and probably the greatest journalist in Pittsburgh history, Robert Payne, the most important historically. He was one of only 700 African Americans to have graduated college during this period between 1823 and 1909. He built his wealth actually as a lawyer defending black defendants who couldn't get white representation. And so he made a bunch of money that way, and then bought the Pittsburgh Courier, and then revamped it into the paper that I just described. But unlike, this is a criticism I have of current media sometimes, is they don't necessarily do watchdog journalism, whereas he would do watchdog journalism with activist organizations in the NAACP. I've investigated nonprofits before, and so if you there's a way that you can investigate nonprofits where you look at something called the 490, which will give you the executive compensation of the organization, it will give you travel expenditures, and you'll also know whether it goes into another category called other expenses or other salaries. And so, for instance, if like an organization is bringing in $1 million and then $500,000 to other expenses or other salaries, you sit there and say, what exactly are the other salaries? He would do that type of reporting on the NAACP, which irritated a lot of people in the black community who thought that the newspaper, a black journalist's role was to basically be an extension of the activist community. I side with his view of journalism, so that even in my own stuff, when I read about, say, for instance, reproductive rights, I still do watchdog journalism of the organizations that I cover. The next one. We can kind of cover that one. And do the next one. So as the black newspapers start shifting the focus, and they send reporters to Johnstown to write about this, to write a bunch of editorial stuff that's going on in Johnstown, it starts drawing the attention of other black newspapers like the Defender. And soon across the country, black newspapers everywhere are writing about what happened in Johnstown. And as the black newspapers describe the incident, the white newspapers like the New York Times, the LA Times, and others start covering it and then also writing editorials about it. And so it starts shifting national opinion on Joseph Cauffiel. And in the South, this was an interesting part. That is a cartoon from the Chicago Defender that says, "A million reasons why the black man should stay in the South." The Johnstown incident was used as propaganda by Southern plantation owners as a reason for why black people should stay put instead of going up north. The Defender and the Courier rebutted those claims by then reminding people of all the terrible things that were happening to the black community in southern states, lynching and unsanitary living conditions and other things that led to poor quality of life. Next one. As the media starts drawing attention to this racial injustice, there are two activists that start paying attention: James Weldon Johnson and Marcus Garvey. Now, I think more people probably know Marcus Garvey just because he's a more well-known name. You see him in high school textbooks. But historically, actually, James Weldon Johnson is the more important figure because in addition to leading the NAACP, he was also probably the most important figure in the Harlem Renaissance. He was a poet, he was a musician, not a musician, he was a poet, a writer, and also a journalist who wrote about other poets. He had relationships with people like Langston Hughes and Towner Collin, Claude McKay, and other famous writers during that time. And he was a very important voice in pushing forth Black art and culture. Next one. During this incident, he was the primary mover in sending telegrams to Gifford Pinchot, who was the governor of Pennsylvania at the time. Pinchot was known as a progressive. His wife was very progressive on racial issues. He was also a conservationist, but he was friends with Cauffiel as well, a personal one, because they were both prohibitionists. They both didn't like alcohol. Next one. And so Cauffiel, or Pinchot, sends an investigator to investigate this. And there's an official investigation, and this is what I'm trying to unearth in Pittsburgh. This, at the time when I did this, was like a really big thing for me because I hadn't written that many books before. But there, you look at the footnotes of local history books, and then there's a little mention of a document, and then you sit there and you go, where was it located, what repository? And so I took a 3-day trip to the Library of Congress, and the document, the footnote was incorrect because they had moved around a bunch of documents, unfortunately. And so I had to spend 3 days researching, and the last file was the folder that said Johnstown. And it had all this and all the telegrams. Unfortunately, there was another investigation done by the state that was in the footnotes of that book, but I couldn't find it. So I don't know. There's about 2 million documents at the Library of Congress. If I can find that document, great. But unless they digitize it, I don't really see that happening. But it's called the document mentality for being reported. So, for instance, in the Stowe Township case in Pittsburgh, I saw the Pittsburgh Courier mention that the county detectives had investigated the Stowe Township racial cleansing. And so this week, after I looked at that, I said, okay, there's a mention of an official investigation here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to file an open records request with the Allegheny County Open Records Officer saying I want to report. And I sent a bunch of microfilm and newspaper clippings. And the way that Open Records works is you file a request, they have 5 days to respond, they can ask for a 30-day extension. And so for the next 30 days until October 5th, they will search for that document within the county detective office to see if they can find it. Now, if they unearth that document, the actual racial cleansing in Pittsburgh happened on October 10th. And that would also be the 100-year anniversary of that incident as well. There were photos in a newspaper of the racial cleansing, the Pittsburgh Daily Post, that I unearthed. I contacted the local newspaper to see if they had the original photos, but there's a strike going on at the Post-Gazette, and I was told that they can't search the archives while the strike's going on. But if we actually manage to find the photographs of the Stowe Township racial cleansing, I don't think there is, to my knowledge, any photographs of any racial cleansing in history. The Tulsa Massacre, there are photos of that, but I don't really think that quite qualifies as a racial cleansing. It's just a riot that destroyed much of that community. There was a 100-year anniversary in 2021 of that. But like I said, I wanted to, I'm trying to track down photographs, I'm trying to do research in other communities, and I'm also using my social media platforms as a means of teaching people, white and black, in other communities, the research methods they would have to employ to reconstruct these events in their own communities. And so I just did a presentation in front of a church, not a congregation. It was like I'm not very religious, but I speak in the church a little bit. It was a gathering of church leaders. And so they asked me what they could do when they went home, and I said, what you can do is you can go through the microfilm of these migration periods from 1917 through 1915 and see if there was a similar event that happened, and if there's newspaper coverage. You can reconstruct it through microfilm, and then you can see if there's, as I said, any official documentation of the incident, which you can then request through open records request. Document mentality. And that's a term they give to investigative reporters, and it's the way that you have to go as a researcher. Next one. So after the investigation, back to the story, the investigation comes back. It's not necessarily whitewashing, but it doesn't accurately describe what happened. But the investigation and the press that came toward the city turned public opinion locally in Johnstown against Cauffiel, and he lost his bid for re-election. One of the other things that I should sit here and say that it didn't go into, the mayor at the time had the same powers as the magistrate, so they had a thing called police court. And so if a defendant was brought before the mayor, he could sentence him to jail or fine him. And that was a tool that Cauffiel used to enforce his order of them to leave. They would round up black people on disorderly charges, they would bring them before court, and then he would say, I can either send you to jail for 3 months, or you can just leave town. And that wasn't included in the report, but it was included in the account that is in fact what he did. Next one. So this is, we say that, we talk about Trump, 4 years later, Cauffiel, there's a crime wave, 2 police officers were killed. He's in the middle of criminal charges, criminal investigation. He runs for re-election and he wins in Johnstown. And then 2 years later, he's in prison and he's released from prison, and then he dies at home. And there wasn't really much mention of the Johnstown incident. These racial expulsions were kind of afterthoughts for a lot of the community. So even in his obituary, it wasn't really mentioned. And then they were actually mourning his death at the time of what happened. Next one. So this is something that I encourage everyone to do. I spoke to the Post-Gazette and I said, that I understand there's also some reticence of white people researching Black history stories. The thing is, and this is just a practical consideration, in places where ethnic cleansings happen, they're almost entirely white. So if you want to sit here and find out, and there was an incident, I found out when I spoke to a church in Bedford County that there was actually a sundown town with a sign that said N-word donors head in this town past sundown. It was on a sign. And I told the person who came to the church to just find a picture of the sign, find a black person that saw it, and then tell the story in a newspaper article. And so if you find out that this happened in the middle part of the state, which is probably where it predominantly happened, you can sit there and then write a nice newspaper article for your local newspaper, or even if you want to write it for the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette, if you would take it, or the Pittsburgh Courier, or some sort of historical document. You can do that. There's also a website, I included this in the Post-Gazette article that I wrote answers for. It's at Toodaloo, where if you find out about a sundown town community, you're supposed to report it to the national database of these communities. So for instance, Johnstown was added to the database for national historians to consult, as this book is a useful reference. For this instance, in the Stowe Township, when I write an article about that, will also be a useful text and document for national racism researchers to use. And we'll have 2 instances in Pennsylvania documented. If there are 400 other ones, then there are other ones that can be researched and documented as well, not only in Pennsylvania, but elsewhere as well too. Next one. Stowe Township, as I said, Beaver County had a racial cleansing, Harrisburg and Altoona, Newcastle, These are all places that happen. Johnstown is the largest racial cleansing that I've seen recorded. In Pittsburgh, it was 500 people. Here, it was 2,000, 3,000. We're still in the early phases of researching this phenomenon. It needs funding badly to research all of it in Pennsylvania as well as elsewhere. And we'll learn more about how they happened and also what to guard against in the future. Since the time the book came out, we've done several things. One, I did presentations at local historical societies, churches, schools, as well as conferences to students in college. I secured a historical marker. It's now in my garage. I was talking to Bruce Asselberg about this coming up, and then getting crew guys to just pour concrete. I was going to help out doing it. And then we also got proclamations from the city, the county, and then Governor Josh Shapiro as well. And this is now officially today. And I hope it's now commemorated yearly as Rosedale Banishment Remembrance Day. It's called the Rosedale Banishment because Rosedale was a black neighborhood in Johnstown, and that's where they left from. Banishment. It was also a term that was generally given to it by the trip down, so I took the note of that as it was called the Rosedale Banishment, and then that was the term that I since applied to the incident, and now it's officially known as that. Next one. Next one. And I'm still doing the oral history, but these are the funding for either, even if it was here or in Pittsburgh, is time consuming and expensive because you have to track movement through census research. And so you would look at, for instance, the 1920 census of the township or Johnstown, and you would see it says black person, Negro, and then you would see the age, and then you would track it across other neighborhoods in Pittsburgh or in other cities. And then you would sit there and try to track down and build a genealogical tree for each one of those people. And then you would use contact repositories like Ben Verified or White Pages and advanced searches to get their phone numbers, and then you would write letters to them saying, is there any recollection or documentation through diaries or photographs of this happening? And that would be the next phase of what you're supposed to do in either this instance or in any other part. And if you wanted to make a case for reparations, I don't get that question a lot. It's harder in Johnstown because it's the case for reparations in these racial cleansings is based on the dispossession of property. And so if a person was forced from their home, they lost that whole value of that home without being compensated. In Johnstown, I've since found out, since the time that this was published, that most of them were squatters. And so there's not really any property value that was assessed because they didn't purchase it. But in a place like Pittsburgh, for instance, if you wanted to go to Stowe Township and say, for instance, like the incident happened in October 1922, let's sit here and say that you cross-reference the census research and you find a black person who purchased a home in 1922, and then it was transferred without any compensation in 1924, then you would know that that person was illegally dispossessed of the property. You would then track down the descendant and say, this is the assessed value of that home now, and this is your case for reparations. You can sue Allegheny County and see if you get compensation, if you wanted to. But that's time consuming and also very expensive to try to connect those dots together. Okay, and that's a fun picture I took outside of Coney Island. Unfortunately, it's closed at 6 o'clock today. I wanted to take you all, but I went before and I got a sun on a hot dog, so, as I always do when I come to Johnstown. And I don't think we're doing questions right now. I think we're just doing a panel discussion.
That's correct.
And then we'll open it up to questions on the panel discussion.
Okay. Thank you.
Jackie Gumby, Johansson, Cody King Swear, and myself. The collaborative organization is on the faculty program, or the Dr. Edmund D. McKenzie branch of the Association for the Study of African American Life and History, represented by Ronald Saunders, Francois Consulting. Mr. Saunders, will you stand up, please? JHA, please stand up, please, Johnstown branch of NAACP, Mr. Alan Cash, is in here.
Nice to see you again, Alan.
Represented by Melanie McDowell and Courtney King Square. The Coalition, and represented by Rachel Allen and Shelley Jones. Thanks for working on it, I appreciate that. And now we're going to transition to the panel.
Yeah, 4th floor immersion. The bank. Yeah. 4th floor. 3 o'clock. Yeah, they moved.
Well, I want to thank everyone for being here. I am Carol Francois, and it's my great pleasure. Actually, I'm Carol Seegers Francois. I grew up in Johnstown. I now live in Dallas, Texas. When I first heard of Cody's book, I knew right away that my company needed to get involved in sponsoring and planning this event. And so it's almost as hot here as it was in Dallas when I left. But it's well worth it. The experience is heat. As Clyde pointed out, we've been planning this program for over a year, and we're just happy to see the turnout here tonight. I'm also happy to see a number of people that I've known all my life and grown up with or went to school with, and I'm glad that you're here to hear this presentation. Cody, I want to thank you for your insight into the banishment that happened here in Johnstown, Pennsylvania. I grew up here, as I said, I'm a Johnstowner, and did not know of that incident until about, 2020 when you wrote your book. And so I would expect that if I didn't know anything about it, not that I know everything, but I can imagine there are a lot of people in Johnstown that did not know this. So I appreciate your delving into it and keeping the story alive, because this is history that must be known. A lot of you probably know that I'm an educator and spent many years in the classroom. So you're going to have to put up with hearing it from a writer right now. I'd like to frame our panel discussion within the context of a quote by the writer James Baldwin. Baldwin said, "The great force of history comes from the fact that we carry it within us, are unconsciously controlled by it, and in many ways, history is literally present in all that we do." It could scarcely be otherwise, since it is to history that we owe our frames of reference, our identities, and our aspirations. And it is with great pain and terror that one begins to realize this. In great pain and terror, one begins to assess the history which has placed one where he or she is and formed one's point of view. Again, not having known this history, it is very important, as I listen and share with you that quote by Baldwin, that really we may not understand how we have been shaped by the history that Cody shared with us, whether you knew it or not. Your history has been impacted by something that happened 100 years ago. So in commemorating this incident, we have to realize that we are actually commemorating a piece and a parcel of ourselves. Now, I'm going to ask Cody, we've had some other instances, and I know you talked about instances in Pennsylvania, but keep in mind that in 1919, there was an outbreak of racial violence known as the Red Summer that affected Black citizens in at least 27 cities across the United States. And that violence, which continued well into the 1920s, with the infamous event that most of us know of as the Tulsa Massacre in 1922, included all types of domestic terrorism, lynchings, murders, banishments, neighborhoods wiped out like Rosedale, and property and land theft. And I appreciate the fact, Cody, that you talk about how and what can be done if you have a history and know that land was taken from you or your family. So you talked about some other instances of banishment based on race or national origin in Pennsylvania that happened. Were any of these as serious or as well, they're all serious, but as impactful as what happened in Johnstown?
I think what makes Johnstown unique as a story, and it's hard to stretch, like for instance, the Stowe Township one, I can't really stretch into a story. This is a very unique instance of racial cleansing because it became a national, international scandal. The fact that Latinos were also involved, there haven't really been that many instances of Mexicans documented where they were forced out of the community this early in history to be this persecuted. And the fact that there was also, the theme for this year's Black History Defiance, correct? The Black newspapers were defiant, and this is the perfect instance of how Black people came to the rescue of their own. A lot of these types of stories, unless there's some sort of a documentation or investigation like I found, are very hard to stretch into a book. Even this work was hard to stretch into a book. But to answer your question, the only instance that I've really researched extensively was in Stowe Township. And there were varying reports that say that I think it was 300 to 500, so it wasn't on the scale. And as of right now, the research that we know, I think this is the largest racial cleansing in Pennsylvania history.
Cody, while you have in mind, I want to ask you, talk about the KKK. And I recall a quote, I think in your book, you said, a member of the Klan said, we want you to understand, this is the quote, we want you to understand that our demonstration tonight, meaning the burning of the crosses, is not directed toward the law-abiding Negroes of Johnstown. We are after that dirty crew that has been sent into Johnstown, those questionable characters gathered from questionable neighborhoods in other cities and dumped upon Johnstown to stage their drunken rebels, their shooting sprees, and their murderous designs. So, obviously, Cody, you've got a KKK member willing to speak out to a newspaper. Were there other instances or situations that involved the Klan in this area that you know of or heard of or wrote about?
Yeah, the Klan at the time, the reason it was so successful was because of its publicity strategy. It localized every appeal, but it would also have church invasions where it would go into churches and ostentatiously hand money to show that they were charitable. And then if they had burnings, they would invite reporters to come up and cover the burnings. And there's a famous photo, I think I included this photo in the presentation in the Johnstown Tribune, where I described them almost as cultish, where it's really creepy, as it always is, of them burning a cross in the newspaper. So Yeah, I mean, they weren't covered, like in the, if you cover a newspaper, like you read journalistic history, the coverage of the Klan in the 20s was covered more as a civic organization. It was membered by respectable people in society, whereas if you do it in the 60s, it's covered as a terrorist organization. And that's whenever the coverage started being more accurate about what their motives and actions were truly like. But I think the Klan's behavior in Pennsylvania, say for instance, was a lot different than in Mississippi. I traveled to Mississippi actually last year, and in the course of actually some of the coverage that I was doing on my reproductive rights stuff, I kind of encountered some of the white supremacists down there, and it's just like there was a historian at Heinz History Center who said he doesn't like to rate or rank racism, but there are certain places I think that you go in America where there are just certain things that would happen that they wouldn't happen elsewhere. And I think Mississippi is one of those places. And I think certain parts of Pennsylvania, like the central parts, are probably more historically troubled by racism than, say, Pittsburgh or Philadelphia. Though there are some substantial issues in both Pittsburgh and Philadelphia as well.
Maybe speaking specifically about racial incidents of terrorism or harm, those kinds of things. Again, there's a difference between systemic racism and that type of racism.
Yeah.
Well, I heard you mention earlier the idea, the concept of the sundown town, and Courtney Square is here. Courtney is a researcher herself, a historian, and my co-host on our podcast, Why Are They So Angry? And Courtney, we did a podcast on sundown town. So what is your history of it and understanding of what a sundown town is? And would you classify Johnstown as a sundown town?
Well, that's a very compound kind of question, because we always,
Those are the kind of questions I do.
and that's the kind of questions I answer. Do you ever wonder why your town is made up the way it is? Why you don't feel safe going to certain parts of central Pennsylvania or Mississippi? That's by design. Sundown towns are towns that were created exclusively to exclude and remove African Americans and other ethnicities, but mostly African Americans. After Reconstruction, which was a glorious dream that did not happen, racial tensions, especially in the North, because of the fear of the Black Plague coming from the South, began to rouse up different neighborhoods. So through town ordinances, which were illegal, through terror acts, meaning we're going to grab a Black man and make the Black people in town watch us lynch and burn him, so you know not to live here. Signage, ethnic cleansings, and all-out burnings and massacres. So that's how sundown towns are created. They're also very secretive. You don't know why your town is a sundown town. People know, but you're not going to write that down because that's not good for the Chamber of Commerce brochure that we're a sundown town. Would I say that Johnstown is a sundown town? If the cleansing worked the way that it was supposed to, yes. But for those ancestors and families that were already rooted and grounded in Johnstown, I'm talking about Bethel AME, I'm talking about Cambria AME, those churches and activists in the community. Yes, there's 3.3% African Americans in Johnstown, but to be considered a sundown town, you must have over several decades 1% or less African American population. Fun fact, there are not a lot of sundown towns in the South because Black people were already discriminated against. It didn't matter. The thing in the North was we do not want these people next door to us out of fear.
Okay. Now we have a little bit of clarification on the idea of a sundown town. And sundown basically meaning when the sun comes down, you, if you're Black or another ethnic group, time for you to leave. You don't let the sun catch you here, or the sun go down on you here. There's an article, and in fact, I want to encourage everyone when we take when we end the program, and I want to thank one of the individuals who came from the Tribune Democrat who brought some of the newspapers from the, I think it was a 3 or 4 part article series that was run about the Rosedale situation. And in that, one of those articles, the reporter said, Mayor Joseph Cauffiel forever transformed the economic and cultural identity of Johnstown. So that's pretty powerful, to change both the culture and the identity of a town. So a banishment does that. So let's think about 100 years where we are now. 1923, now we're 2023. What impact, and I'm giving this question to both Cody and Courtney, what impact do you think that incident of 100 years ago has actually had on this community today, 2023?
I definitely think we're living in a what could be, because we don't know who was expelled, the artists, the mayors, the activists, the teachers, the students, the potential spouses and families that could have been created. 2,000 people is a lot of people, and we'll never know what could have been birthed from that. So I think we're living in the what could have been, but I'm also proud to say of those of us who remained, the beauty that came out of that as well.
Well, I mean, I think last year I spent 2 weeks traveling through the South. So I went through Kentucky, Tennessee, Mississippi, Georgia, Alabama. And you see how important, say for instance in Memphis on Beale Street, that music was, or that in Nashville how Music Row is. And things like music itself are an industry in those types of communities. And the Black community is known historically for having great music, so even things like that, there may have been some sort of famous music street in Johnstown that maybe, I mean, I'm just doing these hypotheticals, you'd have like a place like Beale Street in Johnstown that would have weathered the steel storm, that these things happen in these communities, and more of these historical markers that are present in each community that it happened in, the more cognizant I think people will be of the challenges that people of color have faced in these communities. And maybe that seeing those signs and reading them will in fact maybe make them better people when they realize that some of the things that have happened in their community should never happen again.
I totally agree. When I was a little girl, and my mom is here right now, and I'd get in trouble after my punishment, she would say, well, what did you learn? I didn't want to say anything, but that's why these things are important, because history is not a romance novel. History is a witness of our best and of our worst, and what we want to be, and where we want to strive to be, and who we never want to be again. So yes, it may seem performative to get a plaque or a proclamation, but if one person remembers, not in my town, not to my neighbors, not to my co-workers, that in itself is us triumphing over what happened 100 years ago right now.
And I'm going to throw in one last question around this business of commemoration and history. You'd probably be living under a rock if you did not know that in certain schools around the country, history, such as what we've heard today that Cody shared with us, and history such as what Courtney has talked about Sundown Town, some of this history has been considered inappropriate, that it should not be taught, that it's harmful, that it causes people to feel uncomfortable, it causes some of us who feel that we're being attacked. So here we are today talking about a very painful and very very traumatic incident in our town, my hometown's history. So here we sit, and here we think. And I want to ask Courtney and Cody, why do you think the schools need this? Why do you think this business of banning certain books or banning certain pieces of history may actually be problematic?
Well, I should preface this by saying I think a lot of the challenges of getting the books into curriculum are often the tack taken to try to get them in as well. But I also realize that white privilege also played a role in me getting the books in the curriculum too. But I think it's important if you go into a community that's maybe bucolic or country and speaks in those kind of folksy, down-to-earth terms, to not use abstruse messaging like critical race theory. So, for instance, instead of saying critical race theory, you would say, let's put Black history in curriculums, or let's put Black literature like Langston Hughes in curriculums. The end result of getting it in the curriculums is the same, which is that students engage those perspectives and topics and then grow from them. It's just that the term itself, critical race theory, I think has been misrepresented and demonized, and since it's so abstruse and difficult to understand, even when people ask me what it means, I have a difficult time explaining it. You're going to have a lot more success if you just use those very down-to-earth terms when you go to a superintendent. That's what I did. I said, this is a Black history book. Students are going to benefit from reading it. Now that may seem a lot easier, but I think if they take that approach. But to answer your question about how the impact that it's had, I've read the essays in the Johnstown Tribune Democrat from both Black and white students. And I think there's about 3 years now worth, and hopefully it stays in the curriculums in places like Ferndale and Windber. And all these students will come to realize that we can't let politicians like Cauffiel run this country or run elsewhere, or let these types of values govern their own lives, or, as James Baldwin says, to be cognizant of the history that affects our interactions with people of other races.
I'm going to quote my mother, you won't change until it hurts too much. And that's been said over many crying sessions with my mom, but to relate it to this, if you don't know the hard part, what are you going to change? If everything's a fairy tale and everything is, and they lived happily ever after, and our town has always been perfect, and we have always welcomed everyone, and know the Klan did not burn crosses on hills. Of course, our town is always perfect, but if you live here and you see it, and you feel it, and you know it, and your grandmother knows it, I want all students to understand that no, America is not perfect. It is soaked in blood, but it is also soaked in love. It is soaked in ingenuity. And if you are alive right now, you need to know what happened 100 years ago, so you won't let it happen again, your children won't let it happen again, and your grandchildren won't. So it may be an uphill climb to get stories like this and historical events like this in schools, but it has to happen. We cannot have an ignorant generation of voters. We cannot have an ignorant generation of politicians. We cannot afford it. So we can tell let's do the work. Let's teach the children. I'm 41 years old. I'm not in anybody's high school classroom, but my children will be, my nieces and nephews. So we must do that work, and we must not shy away from those heroes and heroines and even villains of our history, so we can be better.
Well, I'll claim her as my niece. I want to thank Cody and I want to thank Courtney both today for participating in the panel. We're going to move to the next part of our program, so I'm going to give this back. For questions, we're going to have to answer questions and answers. Cody is going to be doing a book signing. And I know many of you want to get a book signed, or if you don't have a book or you don't want to get a book signed, you'll have a chance to come to the table and ask your questions personally to him. So that's how we're going to handle that. But right now, we have some other pieces of business to attend to. So I'm going to give the mic back to this gentleman.
How do I follow that?
Hello, gentlemen.
All right, banishing 2,000 citizens from the city should not go unrecognized. Pennsylvania Governor Josh Shapiro, Mayor Johnstown Mayor Frank Economic, does I say that right? Janako, thank you. understand the gravity and importance of this day, and both the governor and the mayor have sent proclamations recognizing this incident. I will read them right now. Governor first. Greetings, I am honored to commemorate September 7, 2023 as Rosedale Remembrance Day. We are a nation comprised of individuals from all different backgrounds and thrive when we recognize the diversity that brings strength and vitality to our communities. The Black and Latino story in Pennsylvania is one of remarkable contribution to our culture and our shared social fabric, and we are proud to honor their history. The Rosedale Banishment represents a tragic moment in our Commonwealth history. As Governor Pinchot fought for the rights of all Pennsylvanians in 1923, my administration has and will continue to stand for the rights of all people. We cannot tolerate nor excuse any form of hate in our communities, and I firmly believe that no matter your race, religion, or background, you have a place in Pennsylvania. On behalf of all Pennsylvanians, I am honored to commemorate September 7th, 2023 as Rosedale Banishment Remembrance Day. I encourage all Pennsylvanians to acknowledge this important observance and to continue toward the goal of liberty and justice for all. Given under my hand and the seal of the governor at the city of Harrisburg this 7th day of September 2023, the year of the Commonwealth, the 248th. Signed, Josh Carroll. Proclamation from the city of Johnstown. Whereas on August 30th, 1923, the city of Johnstown police officers were wounded and killed in pursuit of Robert Young in the city neighborhood of Rosedale. In response to these shootings, a former Johnstown mayor issued an order that all African and Mexican Americans residing fewer than 7 years in the city be banished, causing forceful displacement of approximately 2,000 persons. And whereas that act as a blatant and egregious embrace of Jim Crow policy and racism upended the lives of hundreds of families who committed no wrongs. They were forced to struggle and endure the loss of their jobs, their homes, and their rightful place in our community, setting back the stability of African and Mexican American communities in Johnstown by decades. And whereas the city of Johnstown condemns the response to the shootings and remembers the anguish of the African and Mexican American communities, we honor their sacrifices, their resiliency, and their undying hope in the pursuit of racial justice. Now therefore, I, Mayor Frank Mayor of Johnstown, Mayor of the City of Johnstown, on behalf of City Council, in remembrance to this 100th anniversary of the Johnstown Banishment of 1923, we offer a solemn resolve to ensure that all citizens of the city are treated with the dignity, respect, and fairness that every person is entitled to at birth. In witness thereof, on this 22nd of August 2023, I briefly set my hand and cause the seal of the City of Johnstown to be affixed. Signed, Mayor.
And we were very fortunate, unfortunate that Senator Casey couldn't join us. However, we are very fortunate that Councilwoman Reverend Sylvia King, at the last minute, was able to get a proclamation, so we're going to ask her to come up and do that for us.
Good evening. First of all, I'd like to take this opportunity to say thank you. Born and raised in Johnstown, and I just recently became aware of this accident in Rosedale because guess what? Certainly wasn't talked about in school. I don't even really know if my parents, if they knew about it, they didn't talk about it. You know, I'm certain my father probably did, but they never told us about it. And Courtney, I am just really shocked because incidents like this need to be told. They need to become a part of our, not only history, but your knowledge, because these are the things that help shape the diversity and the inclusiveness that we strive so hard for in this town. As a council person, I'm glad to see how far we've come. But I believe that when we're able to bring out things of this nature, this only helps to increase us as a society and as a people, because we come to understand that it's very important that we know the good, the bad, and the ugly, because it might answer a lot of the questions that we may have. So I want to thank you so very much for bringing this to the light. I was contacted by Senator Casey's office, and Senator Casey wasn't able to be here today, but he sent this letter and asked me to read this letter on his behalf. It says, "Dear friends, I extend my regards as you mark the 100th anniversary of the Rosedale banishment. In 1923 in Johnstown, Pennsylvania, 2,000 Black and Mexican residents were forced to leave their homes by the then mayor. It was a terrible injustice compounded by the emboldenment of the Ku Klux Klan that impacted those who remained in the community. We must recognize the systematic injustice stemming from our nation's original sin of slavery and fostered by centuries of oppression that disregards the values of communities of color and causes great pain. This milestone stands as a reminder of the work we must continue to do, advance the cause of justice, and ensure our government and nation live up to the promise of liberty and justice for all. Thank you for ensuring this event is not forgotten. Sincerely, Robert P. Casey, Jr., United States Senator." God bless you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mr. Clerk. Proclamation and short remarks on important symbols of memory and restitution, but communities that experience traumatic incidents like the ones discussed tonight must also take time for restoration to work through pain and shame. To help this community address and begin to heal for this almost forgotten history by artists, musician, and yoga teacher, Rachel Allen, to lead the audience in a moment of healing. Proclamation. Mr. Thomas Trubisky, President Commissioner, County of Cameron.
Good evening. My teammate, Commissioner B.J. Smith in the back. B.J., thanks for being here. We were a little late. We got here about 30 minutes ago. We were at Penn Highlands Community College First Police Academy graduation. And as soon as that was over with, we came right here. So thank you for letting us be part of your program. Whereas the Rosedale incident occurred on August 30th, 1923, when 4 law enforcement officers lost their lives in a fatal shooting. Whereas, in response to the Rosedale incident on September 7th, 1923, Mayor Joseph Cauffiel forever transformed the economic and cultural identity of the city of Johnstown when he ordered all African American and Mexican immigrants who have lived in the city for less than 7 years to leave within the city within 24 hours or face fines and jail time. And whereas Mayor Cauffiel decree was never officially made into law, but it was successful in intimidating the attending targets in the wake of the Rosedale incident. And whereas an estimated 2,000 immigrants uprooted their lives and left the city, and the banishment attracted regional, statewide, and nation attention. And whereas Rosedale banishment represents a tragic moment in history that all should learn from. Therefore resolved, we, the Commissioners of Cambria County, do hereby proclaim September 7, 2023 as Rosedale Banishment Remembrance Day in Cambria County. And we ask for all individuals to stand for the rights of all people. Board of Commissioners, myself, Tom Trubisky, Commissioner B.J. Smith, and Commissioner Scott Hunt, attested by Chief Deputy Clerk, Tara County. Thank you.
That's conclusion of our program. I'd like to thank you all for coming to commemorate the Rosedale banishment. Remember, learning this history doesn't keep us rooted in the past. It can give hope for the future and an opportunity to change. Now, please join Cody for book signing after this. And we have a lot of professionals in the room to my right. And get a chance to get a close look at Jackie Gunn's beautiful photo exhibit that's out in the foyer right there. Thank you all for coming.